Okay, let's dive right into this. There was this pretty big statement from Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba recently.
Oh, yeah, the one about Japan's fiscal situation.
Exactly. On May 19th, at the House of Councillors Budget Committee, he said, and I quote, Japan's fiscal situation is worse than Greece's.
Right, and that came up during those talks about maybe cutting the consumption tax and his pushback against using deficit bonds for financing.
It definitely stirred things up.
It did. Almost immediately, you saw overseas media latch onto it. And the very next day, there was this palpable concern about Japan's long-term interest rates creeping up.
Yeah, and predictably, opposition parties, analysts too, they jumped on it, worried about the government bond market.
Understandably so.
So for you listening, especially if you want to get the core of this without getting totally swamped in detail, our mission here is to unpack that comparison. Japan versus Greece.
We'll look at the actual fiscal data, try to understand why so many experts are saying the prime minister's comparison is.
A bit off the mark.
To put it mildly, yeah, we want to give you clarity.
Okay, so the headline grabber was that debt to GDP ratio.
Right. And, if you just look at the numbers, you sort of see where he's coming from. Japan's debt to GDP, it was around 257% end of 2022. That's the Ministry of Finance figure.
Or the IMF estimated it a bit lower for 2023, like 234.9%.
Yeah, somewhere in that ballpark. Now, compare that to Greece. Theirs was roughly 179% from the Ministry of Finance, or maybe 142.2% from the IMF for 2023.
So purely percentage-wise, Japan's number is higher relative to its economy.
It is, but like that single number,
Mhm.
it can be really misleading, can't it?
Totally. It's like judging a company's health just by looking at its total debt versus sales. You miss so much context.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really crucial point, the interest payment burden. How much does it actually cost to service that debt?
Right. Because you could have a massive loan, but if the interest rate is tiny.
Your payments might be perfectly manageable.
Yeah.
And that's kind of been Japan's situation. Historically, super low long-term interest rates.
So the actual payments on government bonds are relatively low. Like, what was it, 2.5% of GDP in the 2024 budget?
Around that, yeah. Now think back to Greece during its crisis. Interest rates on their 10-year bonds, they shot past 30%.
30%? Wow.
Yeah. And their interest payments ballooned to over 10% of their GDP. The difference is just huge.
So Japan's debt pile is bigger proportionally, but the cost of carrying it is way, way lower than what Greece was facing.
Precisely. Now, the prime minister did warn about the horror of a society with interest rates.
Right, I remember that phrase.
But his comment really zeroed in on the potential risk of rates going up and kind of skipped over the current reality, which is still this very low-rate environment.
Okay, so that begs the question, how has Japan kept rates so low with all that debt?
Well, a big piece of the puzzle is the structure of their government bond market. It's quite different.
How so?
Japanese government bonds, or JGBs, they're issued in yen. And critically, they're mostly bought by people inside Japan.
Like banks, pension funds.
Yes, exactly. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and importantly, the Bank of Japan itself hold a huge chunk, about 46.3% at the end of 2024.
So foreign ownership is pretty small.
Relatively speaking, yes, around 12%.
Okay, so most of the borrowing and lending is internal. Why does that matter so much?
Well, for starters, it massively reduces exchange rate risk. You don't have to worry about the yen fluctuating and making your foreign-held debt suddenly more expensive.
Right.
And it also lowers the risk of sudden capital flight. Foreign investors getting spooked and pulling their money out all at once, which can crash a market.
Okay, so contrast that with Greece.
Totally different picture. Their bonds were in euros. They have a much smaller domestic financial base, so they relied heavily on foreign investors.
So when confidence tanked in 2009?
They were incredibly vulnerable. Capital fled, they lost market access, and ultimately needed bailouts from the EU and IMF. Plus, they couldn't just print more euros to manage the situation. They didn't control the currency.
That's a massive difference, having your own currency versus borrowing in someone else's.
It's fundamental. And this leads us straight to the role of the central bank, the Bank of Japan, or BOJ.
They're a huge buyer of these JGBs, right?
A massive buyer. They indirectly support government financing. Now, technically, there are rules against the central bank directly underwriting government debt.
But in practice?
In practice, especially under the current policy of monetary easing, the BOJ's large-scale bond purchases act as a significant backstop.
And there's this concept of the consolidated government. How does that fit in?
Right, that's an interesting lens. If you look at the government and the Bank of Japan's balance sheets together, consolidate them, the JGBs held by the BOJ are essentially an internal debt, an asset for the BOJ, a liability for the government.
So they kind of cancel each other out from that perspective.
In a way, yes. It makes the whole picture look less precarious in terms of an immediate collapse. Again, Greece, being part of the Eurozone, had no such internal mechanism. Its monetary policy was set externally by the European Central Bank. Japan has monetary sovereignty.
Huge difference. So given these structural contrasts, how do international rating agencies view them?
Well, the credit ratings reflect this difference. Japan generally has solid investment-grade ratings. S&P gives it an A+, Fitch an A, both with a stable outlook.
And Greece?
Greece is lower, though it has improved. Fitch has it at BBB, which is just investment grade, but with a positive outlook.
Interesting. And S&P has that AAA rating for Japan on something specific.
Yeah, for what they call the transfer and convertibility assessment, basically, the risk of restrictions on foreign exchange. It reflects confidence in Japan's underlying economic strength, its institutions, its financial system.
So the international view seems to be, yeah, Japan's debt is high, but it's a mature economy with deep domestic savings, giving it flexibility, not like Greece pre-crisis.
That's the general consensus, yes. But the Prime Minister's words did have an impact, didn't they?
They did. You mentioned interest rates ticked up.
Yeah, right after his remarks, Japan's long-term interest rates rose, which means JGB prices fell. As one economist, Hideo Tanaka, noted, it seemed to shake confidence a bit.
Even if rates were already drifting up slightly because of the economy.
Exactly, sort of amplified that trend. It added fuel to the fire, you could say.
And the political and expert reaction was sharp.
Oh, very sharp. Yuichiro Tamaki from the Democratic Party for the People expressed serious concern about the bond market impact, even hinted at political fallout for the PM.
And the experts.
Some were scathing. Tanaka Hideyomi, the economist I mentioned, called the remarks indicative of the worst possible economic policy sense. He even suggested the prime minister should resign over the damage to confidence in JGBs.
Wow, strong words. So the statement itself wasn't just noise. It had real, measurable consequences, at least in the short term.
Absolutely. Markets react to signals, especially from the top.
What about overseas? You mentioned media pickup, but what was the vibe, say, on social media among investors?
Reports suggest it ranged from genuine surprise to, frankly, ridicule. Lots of, wait, what kind of comments. Some chatter about Japan becoming a bit of an international laughingstock over it.
Ouch.
Yeah. The general feeling online seemed to be that the comparison was just fundamentally flawed economics, and it created unnecessary anxiety, both at home and abroad.
It really feels like some basic misunderstandings about government debt might be feeding into this.
I think so. There's this simplistic view sometimes. Government bonds, debt, just like my credit card.
But it's not the same, especially when you issue debt in your own currency.
Exactly. That right to issue currency is key for a country like Japan. And just focusing on the amount of debt, especially with Japan's ultra-low interest rates, is dangerous. Experts suggest looking at broader sustainability indicators. Things like net interest payments, which you actually pay after accounting for interest received. The primary balance is crucial too. That's government revenue minus spending before interest payments. It shows the underlying fiscal direction.
And national assets.
And national assets, yes. You need a fuller picture.
What about the whole burden on future generations argument that always comes up?
It does, and look, it's a valid long-term concern. Deficit spending does imply future obligations, but crucially, that's very different from the imminent default risk Greece faced. It's a long-term challenge needing structural reform and growth, not necessarily a sign of impending doom.
It's not like this Japan is the next Greece idea is brand new either.
Oh, definitely not. It's popped up periodically for years, and economists have pretty consistently pushed back against it.
You have theories like MMT.
Right. Modern monetary theory explicitly argues that countries like Japan or the U.S. with monetary sovereignty just don't face the same constraints as Eurozone members like Greece did.
And those favoring continued monetary easing point to the persistently low interest rates as proof against the debt crisis narrative.
Exactly. They'd say, if the debt was such a crisis, why haven't rates exploded? Even back during the European debt crisis, analysts were careful to highlight the massive differences in economic scale and social structure between Japan and Greece.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The main takeaway from this deep dive.
I think the core point is, yes, Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is high, very high, but comparing it directly to Greece, as the prime minister did, is really an oversimplification.
It ignores too many crucial differences.
Way too many. The currency, the incredibly low interest rates historically, who holds the debt, the role of the central bank, the international credit standing, they're just fundamentally different situations.
So it's a reminder to look beyond one single number.
Absolutely. You need that wider context, multiple indicators, for a calm, accurate assessment of the fiscal situation.
Right. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, Japan's unique position, the controversy this remark sparked, what are the potential long-term effects when influential figures make statements like this? Even if the underlying reality is complex, what does it do to market confidence and how the world sees Japan down the road?
Yeah, that's definitely something worth pondering. Perception can take on a life of its own.